There are many questions about the history and the identity of the people known as Igbo on the west coast of Africa. There are some questions about their origins. There are some questions about their general historical narrative. And one question that pops up is the meaning of this word Igbo. And we've looked at this word before, and we've done quite a bit of deconstruction related to the Igbo. We've even found an Igbo island. Now, with respect to the Americas, the narrative is that the Igbo arrived in the Americas based upon the transatlantic slave trade. Now, there are additional narratives that appear to be emerging that suggest, perhaps, that the west coast of Africa was not completely brought over in an enslaved condition, and many of the entities that came over were actually colonizers. And if you think about the dynamics in the Caribbean and how the socio-political dynamics have evolved, you might better understand that this whole dynamic appears to be a settler colonizer dynamic. And in many instances, and I'm talking specifically about the Caribbean, in many instances, the individuals were perhaps simply colonizers. You also see this dynamic going on with respect to South America, and it's possible that a bit of this was going on in the southern eastern portion of mainland North America, what people identify as the United States. But again, there are lots of questions about the true identity of the people on the west coast of Africa and the actual involvement of this particular collective of people in the colonization of the Americas. And I don't mean an earlier colonization, I mean colonization during the Columbus time of colonization. And so it seems like there was some sort of Confederate dynamic going on and a creolizing of these identities to take some identities from some entities and give some entities other identities. But when looking at this Igbo dynamic, we see some interesting things have emerged related to the meaning of Igbo. Now, many people offer all sorts of things related to Igbo, suggesting that they are a derivative in terms of that name of the Eber or Aber or Hebrew collective. There's something else that comes up though when looking at this Igbo word, and there's also notation that the spelling of Igbo has gone through a few iterations. And it's not clear that the narratives that are being given for these iterations, it's not clear that those are correct, but we are going to deal with those. And so first, what we're going to do is look at the history of the Igbo in America with respect to this place known as Igbo's Landing. And many people will recall this story, but we're just going to revisit it, and then we're going to revisit a little bit about these name changes with respect to the spellings and how changing the spelling of Igbo perhaps changes the history of Igbo and the meaning of Igbo in totality. And those depictions were depictions of the Biafran War that took place. And what we see here in the New Georgia Encyclopedia is that Igbo is spelled E-B-O. You do not see I-G-B-O, you see E-B-O. And it indicates Igbo's Landing. It indicates here the story that gives Igbo's Landing its name is one of the most colorful and enduring tales in Georgia's rich literary history. And it is better known to some as the myth of the flying Africans. And there are narratives about the Igbo resisting slavery and then going into the ocean. But what we are really focusing on is the spelling. And so we see Igbo's Landing here. It's also noted that these letters EBO are found in a number of words in terms of the Yoruba. It indicates here, and this is from Golden Isles, the history of Igbo landing is one of defiance to being enslaved. Today, the story is both morally and historically relevant, as it has become an essential part of African American history as one of the events that sparked the anti-slavery movement in the Western world. In 1803, a group of 75 Africans from Igbo land, now note, this Igbo, when it gets to Igbo land, is IGBO. Okay, it's indicating that this is in present day Nigeria. These entities were captured and brought to Georgia aboard a ship, according to the narrative. And they were supposed to be taken to a location to serve as slaves on a plantation field. However, according to the narrative, this particular narrative, the Igbo walked in unison into Dunbar Creek, choosing death over enslavement. Okay, and so that's pretty much the way the narrative goes. There was this self-sacrifice in order to avoid enslavement. Now, I also want to point out that the anti-slavery movement among individuals that were enslaved in the Americas, according to the standard narratives, those movements started far before 1803. However, it indicates here, now this is a different spelling of Igbo, and this is just IBO, and this is Igbo landing, the legacy of resisting enslavement. And it indicates here in 1803, Igbo, now it's IGBO. Okay, so when you see all of this playing around with these spellings, it is usually noteworthy. Then it also indicates also IBO or EBO from West Africa revolted while on a slave ship in Dunbar Creek. It is believed that at least 10 Igbo drowned, choosing death over enslavement. Again, and you also have this history intertwined, of course, with the Gullah Geechee. But what I want you to pay attention to is the fact that the spelling of this name has changed, and this spelling of this name changing is significant. So basically, they no longer want us to use EBO when talking about the IGBO people. And so we are supposed to say Igbo or Igbo versus Igbo with the EBO. It indicates here, and this is coming from the BBC, after the Biafra War, where do people of the Igbo tribe stand in modern day Nigeria? Okay, so here we have this narrative, this story related to the Igbo, and at this time, Igbo is being spelled EBO, and so that's the name of the tribe. However, there is something very interesting about this name, Igbo, in relation to the Yoruba, and it does not automatically come across as a language group as has been presented previously. There's something more going on with this Igbo identity. And so there's a perhaps very important reason for Igbo being changed from EBO to IGBO. Now, of course, there are many explanations for this. However, we're just focusing on this interesting notation here. And so Igbo, in terms of the translation from the English into the Yoruba, means sacrifice. And here you can see it more clearly. It's indicated that this is a noun. And so this Igbo dynamic is not a verb. And so it's not the act of sacrificing. It is an entity. It's a noun that is a sacrifice. And so the word Igbo in the Yoruba is sacrifice. And it indicates here, with respect to the definition, an act of slaughtering an animal or person, or surrendering a possession as an offering to a deity or a supernatural figure. There are some synonyms indicated here that specify that we are talking about sacrifice. It indicates ritual slaughter, offering, self-sacrifice, or sacrifice. Now we're going to look at this piece of literature that gives some indication as to the origin of this name as an identity, as a collective, as a tribe. I also want to note that at some point in time, the Yoruba and the Igbo were at odds during this Biafran War. And according to many narratives, the impression was that the Yoruba sold the Igbo out in terms of this particular war. And so we're getting this historical narrative that's coming from a Yoruba perspective. It's not coming from an Igbo perspective with respect to this particular text. And again, we see this Reverend Samuel Johnson again. And so this again is a very prominent and influential individual in Nigeria's history. And so this text is the history of the Yorubas from the earliest times to the beginning of the British Protectorate. And this is written by Reverend Samuel Johnson. There are lots of Johnsons, by the way, in Nigeria. Yes. And then we have a Dr. O. Johnson who is editing this particular text, first published in 1921. And then the last reprinting was 1960, according to this particular offering. I also want to point out that it appears that specifically the Yoruba have been heavily involved in the colonization of the Americas. And so with respect to the Oyo, the Yoruba, these various names that we've been given for this particular collective of people or these collectives of people, it really appears that they are major colonizers and perhaps in many instances coming under the guise of slavery in terms of the historical narratives that have been provided. But there are many indications that appear to be growing that indicate that the Yoruba were very involved in the colonization of the Americas and in also the colonization of the indigenous people of the Americas. Because what you see right now with respect to the Caribbean, yes, you see indigenous people in the Caribbean, but what you also see are entities that came from Africa and that came from Europe, and those are the ones who own pretty much and occupy these various lands that were indigenous American lands. However, there's a narrative that suggests that many of these entities were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. However, based upon some of the narratives and the way that things have evolved and the way that many people in the Caribbean understand the history of slavery, it brings into question the extent to which they were enslaved in the same way that many people in mainland America were enslaved. And so there are lots of questions. And then there are some superimpositions of culture coming from the Yoruba into the Americas on that south corridor and that southeastern region. There are these manifestations of Yoruba that are colonizer types of manifestations related to the Yoruba in what would be considered Indian land. And so what we see here with respect to this narrative that this individual is presenting is that they wanted to create this text in order to help to make sure that the Yoruba people would be well acquainted with their own history. They had been acquainted with the history of England and Rome and Greece and all of those types of places, but they didn't know anything, according to this author, about their own country. And so this person was seeking to give them a narrative that they could understand about their own country. Of course, there are some questions about that too, because there are questions about the colonization of the west coast of Africa and how it mirrors the colonization of the Americas. And so it's very possible and highly likely that those who are speaking and giving the histories are also the colonizers of the west coast of Africa. And it's also highly likely that they have superimposed identities onto the entities that were indigenous to the west coast of Africa and then taken their identities entities from them, because that's what we see actually when looking at the American Indians on the southeastern portion of the United States specifically, and also very specifically in Brazil. So it's very obvious in Brazil, this whole colonization dynamic. And it suggests that there's something else going on other than the slave trade and victimization through the slave trade. Now, we also know that when entities are seeking to colonize, there is the sending forth of an oppressed class often to do the groundwork for the colonization. And so many of these entities might have found their way into the Americas as what would be considered indentured servants in many ways, or they could have been enslaved. But ultimately, it looks like part of the purpose of bringing them or transporting them to the Americas was to transport a culture, African cultures or whatever cultures these really were, but to transport those cultures into the Americas, superimpose them onto the indigenous people, create a creolized identity, and create confusion while taking the actual identity of the indigenous people of the Americas and giving them an African identity. Hopefully that all made sense. Now back to this narrative about the tribes. And so what we find is, with respect to this Igbo word, we find that there is additional evidence that Igbo, in terms of the Yoruba, Igbo means sacrifice. And so this is some information about the origin of the tribes. I also want to point out that many of these words are Hebrew-ish sounding words. And so there is apparently some sort of entanglement with respect to the people on the west coast of Africa, Yoruba specifically, and Hebrew and the Igbo. There is something going on there, and it's not completely clear what exactly is going on. But when you look at some of these words, sometimes you see that these are words that you find in the Hebrew, and the constructs are very similar. And so here's this interesting narrative about this Igbo name. You saw Obonita and then Ibonita. And so it indicates here that it is rather curious that both accounts should have made them descended from victims of human sacrifices. This latter account is reconcilable with the former, which says they are the food of the deep. For the population of which Ibonita was the head may have been largely augmented by the victims of the ocean, so as to give the name, I'm not going to try to pronounce this, but it is IJE hyphen and then IBU, Ibu, to the whole of them. And so this identity of a sacrifice was put onto a collective of entities. And so when it brings up this idea of victims of the ocean and food for the deep, it brings up the question of whether the Igbo are somehow related to the water deity known as Yemaya. And so there are some questions about that, this idea of food for the deep and this idea of being victims of the ocean. And so there's a question about, all of these water narratives related to the Igbo, Igbo's landing, food for the deep, victims of the ocean, and this idea of Igbo meaning sacrifice for the Yoruba. And so this Reverend Samuel Johnson goes on to indicate of all the Yoruba tribes, with the exception of the Ife, they were the most addicted to human sacrifices, which they practiced up to 1892 when the country was conquered by the English. The victim also usually offered to Obanita, annually was also always a human being. But this was never killed. He was, however, always acted upon in some way or other unknown by magic arts, that he always became demented and left to wander about sheepishly in the, I believe this is pronounced Aha forest, until he perished there. This is no doubt due to the fact that the ancestor Ibonita himself, when a victim, was not killed outright. There are interesting stories about how African culture was transplanted into the Americas that makes absolutely no sense given the standard slave narrative that is spelled out in terms of the American or U.S. history. And so all of this coming and bringing their culture, bringing their foods, bringing their religion, it's unclear how all of this was taking place in a slavery narrative, at least the one that was presented in mainland America. So it doesn't comport with this. And so something else had to be going on for them to have this type of power to bring this type of culture to the United States, to the Americas, to Indian land. Something else had to be going on for that to be facilitated. And you see this throughout the Caribbean. You see this in certain parts of the United States, of the Americas. And you definitely see this in Central America and South America. And so very specifically, this very heavy Yoruba influence, this heavy Yoruba culture that has been transplanted into the Americas, that again makes no sense given the narratives that have been presented in terms of the history. Because what's described is basically a colonizer dynamic. It is not an enslavement dynamic that is being presented. It goes on here to indicate they were before the conquest the most exclusive and inhospitable of the whole of the tribes. Very few, if any, outsiders were ever known to have walked through the country with impunity under any circumstance whatsoever. Not a few of those who attempted to do so were never seen nor heard of anymore. Okay. So continuing on with this Igbo as sacrifice narrative, it indicates here, but who was this Oba Nita? Tradition says he was also a victim of sacrifice by the Olowu or king of Owu. That might not be pronounced correctly, but that's the best that we've got right now. It was said that the Olowu offered in sacrifice a human being where two roads cross. This was termed Igbo ni Ita, a sacrifice on the highway, the victim being mangled and left for dead. He, however, revived at night and crawled away into the forest, where he subsequently recovered and survived. Okay, and so this idea of Igbo Nita is referring to this idea of a sacrifice on the highway. This was converted, according to this, to Oba Nita, meaning a king on the highway. Now, consistent with what would be expected, we find this surname Igbo manifested in North Carolina and the Virginia area. And so this individual, John Igbo, completed this draft registration card, and this entity was living in Virginia. This entity was born, according to this, in 1905 in North Carolina. And the wife of the person was Ruth Pleasant Igbo. And here you can see this entity is classified as Negro with brown eyes, black hair, and a black complexion. And here we have another Igbo. This is Ernest George Igbo. And again, this is with that EBO spelling. This entity was born in 1884. And they were born in Romeo, Michigan. Now check this out. So this man, whose surname is Igbo, who was born in Romeo, Michigan, was initially classified as Negro. However, the classification was changed in this draft registration report to Indian. It indicates here that the person had brown eyes, black hair, and a black complexion. Now, one thing is clear is that with respect to the Yoruba language, this Igbo construct, no matter how you spell it, there are some negative implications related to this particular word, this noun. Even with Igbo, IGBO, there is this indication that it means weed. And so this Igbo identity is shrouded in a bit of mystery, of course. This includes the narratives related to that Igbo island, which is basically a slave island. And then you have these odd narratives related to Igbo's landing. And so there are all sorts of questions about the identity of the Igbo and the meaning of Igbo. And it is noteworthy that you have a collective of people that have identified another collective of people or a subset of people as sacrifice, that is their identity. It's also noteworthy that the spelling of this particular word has evolved in the Americas, in mainland America specifically. It has evolved from Igbo, sacrifice, to this IGBO without any real explanation for the purpose or the reason for the change. Now, of course, there's a narrative about EBO being an anglicized version, a colonized version of IGBO. However, that remains to be seen in terms of whether that is true, because we have here an entire narrative about this Igbo Nita that conforms to the narrative that we have about this etymology of this Igbo word, this meaning sacrifice.